and gentlemen, I'm honored to welcome you to the very first World Higher Education Ranking Summit. And WERS brings today the most prominent change makers, leading academics, leaders in their field that will share invaluable knowledge to help you and your institution go forward and implement best practices and best ideas. And today's topic is vital because today we will talk about diversity and internationalization in academia. This is an extremely important topic for everyone, regardless where they come from. That's why today I'm really honored because today we have some extraordinary speakers joining us from different parts of the world, most distinguished academics, leaders in their field, extraordinary human beings. So I'm really honored to introduce you. First of all, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Georgette. Dr. Georgette is actually joining us from Canada, and Dr. Georgette, she is currently the Executive Vice President at Corporate Class Inc. and Practice Lead for their Center for Diversity and Inclusion. Dr. Zenati has been an executive and senior leader at the University of Toronto. Dr. Zenati holds a bachelor's degree in English and Political Science, master's in Business Administration degree from the University of Liverpool, and Masters of Science from the Hanley School of Business, and also leading strategic change within organizations from Harvard University. She also holds a doctorate in business administration, a joint program with the Rotman School of Business. Dr. Zenati is also a professor at Western University, as well as the Rotman School of Business. Dr. Zenati has worked at the University of Toronto for more than 2 decades, where she held numerous leadership positions, and most recently she served as an executive director of advancement in the Faculty of Engineering. And what is more, Dr. Georgette, she is extremely involved in everything that is related to leadership and empowering women. So she also recently launched a nonprofit called Women Helping Empower Women, and published a book on the society and the scarcity of women and diversity in leadership called Why Not You, where 100% of the profits go to the nonprofit she has started to help millions of women around the world. It's a great pleasure to have you here, Dr. Georgette.
Thank you.
And I would like to introduce you to our next speaker, our guest that is now in Puerto Rico. And I'm really honored and privileged to introduce Dr. Peter Reyes. He's the founder of Peter Reyes Consulting. He has served diverse organizations, including businesses, religious institutions, government, higher education, and nonprofits in the areas of organizational diversity, equity, and inclusion. Moreover, he's very experienced in leadership development and change. Dr. Peter is a lecturer at Penn State. He has served as vice president at 2 universities and is the author of another incredible book, Untold Stories: The Leadership Experience in Higher Education. It's a great honor to welcome you here, Dr. Peter. Thank you so much for your presence.
Gracias.
And now I would love to introduce you to Dr. Michael Leslie. And Dr. Michael Leslie is an associate professor in the College of Journalism and Communication in the University of Florida. Dr. Michael teaches courses and conducts research on international and intercultural communication, ethics, and leadership. Professor Leslie has taught, lived, and conducted research in Asia, Europe, Latin America, Africa, including China, India, Belgium, France, Mexico, Cuba, Brazil, Zambia, Cameroon, South Africa, Mozambique, and Angola. Professor Leslie served as senior foreign expert in the School of English and International Studies at Beijing Foreign Studies Universities. And He also is not only a Fulbright senior specialist in intercultural communication at the University of Maastricht in Belgium, and he was a Fulbright scholar and advanced school of mass communication in the University of Cameroon. And I know that Dr. Leslie also has his own consulting firm called Gemini Consulting, and he has been a great mentor to many people around the world. This is just brilliant because today we have a really amazing group of people that have been working all their life on issues of internationalization and diversity. That's why my first question is to anyone who is open to answer it. But the first question is on why diversity and internationalization should be at the forefront of every institution across the globe.
I can go first if you want. I can start. Well, I feel like, the future of every organization and every university is global. I mean, every university is talking about the fact that we want to recruit more students, we want to be able to be more global. This is really the makeup of every future university. And for us to be able to do that, for academic institutions to be able to do that and have students be welcome and feel welcomed, we have to be able to understand diversity and be inclusive. And that actually means that, we have to have equality, inclusion in terms of even how we're recruiting them and thinking about from the recruitment process to how we bring them in terms of, all of that, but also from the staffing perspective, from the teaching perspective, from the, changing the mindsets of how we, the people that are not only educating from the administrative staff and onwards. So the reality is education is now more globally accessible. We see this. I mean, certainly in Canada, the way that the education has been changed. Certainly I can tell you Canadian institutions rely a lot more on international students than they ever have 20, 30 years ago. So for academic institutions, this is really critical. And certainly if you want to become a top tier institution, if you want to be an institution that attracts the very best minds in the world, we know the very best minds in the world are minds that come from all over the world and diverse perspectives. And so to do that, you have to be an institution that actually attracts that. In order to attract that, you've got to be a place that actually has, a mindset and a place that makes people feel welcome. And so if your organization and your institution does not look like the people that are going to come, then they're not going to feel welcome and they don't feel like they belong. So I think from that perspective, it is really, really critical to make sure that how you recruit is important, what the makeup of the people that work at your institutions look like. And I'm sure my colleagues here can contribute more to that, but I'm going to start there and let them finish.
I'd like to build off of that. I think that's some great points, Dr. Zanotti. When we think about internationalization and diversity, the first thing that comes to mind why institutions should be, if not already moving in that direction, is because we already see many institutions either going bankrupt, merging, or having to close their doors some way or another. With technological advances and globalization, as my colleague just expressed, there's really no other way moving forward in a globalized society. We are creating global citizens. And if you want to be competitive in this market space, not just, and it doesn't necessarily, I would like to say this carefully, it matters where you're at around the world, but also how you address your diversification. So you can receive international students on your campus, but also if you have online education, then everything that you would do in a brick and mortar needs to translate and be contextualized in your online space. And I'm sure we can talk more about that later. And for me, I would focus on, in particular on the leadership of the institution. As Dr. Zanotti said, does your leadership represent the student body that you are recruiting and bringing in? Are there women and others, LGBT? Are there people from bicultural and bilingual spaces? People who understand the socioeconomics of students and the context from where students come from. It's very important because as we talk about a sense of belonging, I see myself in your institution. Therefore, I feel like I belong. I can be myself, right? It's one thing to come to a place, but you have to assimilate. It's another thing if you come to a space and you can be totally unique and still belong. And I think that's the intersection where, and I think that's the good spot where institutions should try to achieve or try to attain, where students, faculty, staff, administration can be totally themselves and still belong, right? And so we want that. We want the diversification of our people. I want Dr. Michael, Dr. Zanetti to be themselves in the institution. You speak 5 languages, great, bring it. You know, you're an expert in this field or that field, your cultural background. And so I think that that's all imperative for an institution.
I would just add one other perspective, I hope, on this question. And that's that I remember some time ago, this is ancient history, perhaps for some of you, but the University of, I think the University of Texas had challenged affirmative action at the Supreme Court, right? Someone at the University of Texas anyway challenged it. And Harvard University submitted an amicus brief supporting affirmative action. And the basis for the brief was Harvard said, look, we need this because our students, and I think they were talking about the majority of the students, the white students, need to have exposure to the rest of the society that we live in. They're not going to be able to work with Latino communities. They won't be able to work with Black communities if we don't have any Black and Latino leadership at the level of an elite institution like Harvard University. So I mention this because our own students, the majority students at most of our elite universities, and you know, I'm not very well versed in the community college level and so on, but you know, we have where I'm at, the University of Florida. I think there's a 6% or 7% are African American. I believe the Latino percentage is higher, closer to 9%. And the white students at the institution are the ones who will benefit from having those minority students there. In the same context that when we internationalize, it's great to have that diversity, but it's really, really important for the majority students to be exposed to diversity. They're the ones that are going to have to, in the corporate setting or in the educational setting, have to relate, to have to understand, to have to be able to not just, it's not about assimilating, right? It's about deepening our understanding of the world that we live in, so that even as, if I could say this as an American, even as we are in our own country, that we understand that the world doesn't necessarily look like us, you know. So that's my addition to what's been talked about.
These are some brilliant points, and it's super important to understand that everything comes from the leadership, and leadership of institution is a priority to showing an example to students, to staff, how to counter inequality and how to advocate for diversity and internationalization. In your experience, did you see this practical situations where students were actually members of staff and leaders in their university were not prepared for internationalization? Because sometimes we see that, okay, they're accepting the students from different backgrounds, but when it comes to actually learning how to deal with them, understanding them, what still is the biggest challenge in institutions according to your experience? Thank you.
I'll take a stab at that one first, if that's okay. So I could speak from the United States context, but I think globally this has relation. You know, one of the main things is, like Dr. Michael was saying, about helping the majority culture, white students, in terms of when they leave the institution, and obviously there's adult students, so on and so forth, but that, you know, sometimes you will be interacting with other people. I think one of the main challenges that we are facing is that, you know, for so long, white supremacy reigned, right? And so now you have many, I wouldn't say challenging, but we are in some ways challenging white supremacy, white privilege, male privilege and dominance, right? And so there's change. We have women CEOs. We have folks from the LGBTQIA2S plus community, leading and serving strategic institutions. We have people who are bilingual, people who are diverse, not only race and ethnicity, but their background, language, culture, religious perspectives. I mean, it's very diverse. And so historically, we had one group leading, and now you have many people, the doors are opening, and we continue to diversify. And so that brings change. And human nature, naturally, I think, is to resist change. And so I think anytime you're challenging, disrupting white supremacy, white privilege, or what I like to call the 3 Ps, right? Privilege, power, and profit, that brings some complications. And so from a leadership perspective, leaders need to be ready, need to be competent, sensitive, cultural humility, cultural responsiveness, utilizing these skill sets and also working in teams to move the institution along. And it takes time. Some of us are tired of waiting. Let's just keep it real, right? Some of us are tired of waiting. So we don't want to hear, you need to be patient, just sit there. We can be patient and move. And so I think that's where, we need to work together and collectively to think about institutions that were not created, for example, with me in mind, right? Most institutions in the US and many globally were not created with a Latino from New York City in mind. And so now you have people like me and other people at institutions. And so we need to rethink policies. We need to rethink a lot of historic structures, the way things are done. For example, and I'll leave it here for my colleagues to join in. The way we search, right? So let's say you have a search for a faculty member. Well, who's on that search committee? And who do you have on that search committee that will mitigate bias, that will mitigate discriminatory behaviors or thoughts? You don't want all of the same type of people or culture to be in your search committee, because we know from business literature, right? You'll get what's called groupthink, and everybody thinks the same. And so we need a diversity in that search committee. We need policies, maybe a chief diversity officer, somebody from human resources that's going to help us to mitigate our own, because we all have biases. And so I'll leave it there.
I was just going to add to that, it's interesting in Canada. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with I live just outside of the city of Toronto. So the city of Toronto, if I'm not mistaken, is actually the most globally diverse city in the world. So we actually have over 100 and I think 68 languages that are spoken in our city alone. It is actually, if you come in, if you want to experience a multitude of cultures and backgrounds, come to Toronto and you'll see it all. So, so it's really great. So if you go to something like the University of Toronto or one of the universities that are in the greater Toronto area, that's what you'll experience. So universities in Canada, particularly in the Toronto region, have had to really rethink what it is in terms of how they do both, integration. So when students come in, and how do we do that? So one of the things that I'll give you an example. One of the areas, certainly when I was at the University of Toronto, that we saw was this great influx of students coming in from mainland China. And so the question was, how do you bring them in? How do you get them not just assimilate, but just get them accustomed to a whole new culture that they were not used to? And so, the university created a program where they would come in literally from, the spring, May, and spend 4 months living on campus before September actually started, to teach them on how to use the subway system and teach them a little bit about Canadian culture, and to teach them, how to open a bank account, because that is not what they would have been used to in their own countries, just so that when September started, there wasn't a culture shock. But the other part of it was even things like the university had to create spaces for students who were Muslim that had prayer And so you have to remember, our buildings were not designed for students who had to go and, wash and prepare. Like 30 years ago, that is not how buildings were designed. And we were not necessarily accommodating for things like this. We also have indigenous, students. And so again, there's things like smudging ceremonies and things that maybe people are not familiar with. But now with our Truth and Reconciliation, we're now doing things like this that we were never doing before. So there's a lot of things, as my colleague Peter said, that we were not, but we're moving, and things are changing, and universities are trying to accommodate. And there's a question of, just becoming more familiar and accommodating from that perspective, not just for the students, but also educating and hiring. And as you said, in terms of our faculty, also recognizing that when positions are being hired, are we actually creating those, and with hiring committees also, and of course we can talk about blind recruitment. That's a whole other theory I have, and we know that when we go to blind recruitment, we hire better, and that when we take off all of the names and things, we tend to be a lot more diverse in our hiring. And I'll stop there.
I think I want to thank you both, Peter and Georgette. I think I want to actually address the question, Angelica, that what are some of the things that have not changed perhaps, or that are still barriers? And I'm at the unit, well, to start with, the University of Florida is a land grant institution in the South. So we have a different experience than the one that Dr. Georgette has been talking about. Admirable what you're doing there in Toronto. We're very slow to change, and so at the level of, for example, where there's some of the barriers, that the level of staff, a lot of our staff, I would say the majority are monocultural. So when they're dealing with international students, when they're dealing with minority students, they have a perspective that is basically, you need to find some way to fit in here, and this is the way we do things here. And so it makes it quite challenging for the international students, and of course for the minority students. That's one of the reasons why some of our numbers, the international piece has changed dramatically, because international students bring in cash, right? So, there's a little more sensitivity to that. But not that much so. It's still, you must find a way to fit in. The other piece of this, besides the administration, and we know that at in our institution, at the administrative level, the higher administration level, it's pretty much lily white, or lily white and lily white female, right? So that also is an additional, in terms of perspective and understanding. I mean, that's also there as a barrier, if you would. And then, of course, faculty. Some faculty have had the opportunity to travel internationally, but I'm not certain that the travel itself has produced a shift or transformation in their perspective about who they are. Or I had made a note of this, Peter. Privilege, power, and profit.
They
still see themselves as the arbiters of what the way academics should be, how students should be trained, and it's the it's an ethnocentric model, if you would. So I think those are some of the barriers that we face as we grapple with how to diversify and how to internationalize.
Michael, and I just want to be clear that, the academic institution is still not diverse in terms of faculty and leadership, but the strategy in terms of recruitment, that's part of our human rights and part of our, part of the policies in Canada. So from a student recruitment perspective, we're able to bring them in, but that doesn't mean the institution makeup has changed. So it's probably
just one more thing. I know, Angelica, you have another question you want to move to, but just one more thing, since we're talking about recruitment. I don't know that there's been a significant shift in the criteria that's used in recruitment. So it's we give you a quick example. We'll diversify our pool, so it looks very good that now we're looking for Latinos and we're looking for Blacks and we're looking for the story. And then, but what we expect from the folks that are recruited is very much what is expected traditionally from white students who have, some of them have the privilege of having had, multiple papers published and or maybe come from economic backgrounds that give them an edge, if you would, in the recruitment process. So, I understand diversification and I understand search committees. What I don't understand yet is how we're going to adjust the criteria for selection such that more people who are not in the institution become incorporated into our institutions.
Yes, this is absolutely important for everyone to understand, because we have the audience that is watching us today are those people that are making those decisions. We are lucky to have that audience, but these challenges need to be addressed. And it's not enough just to change the policy. It's really important to help those new recruits, if it's staff, to actually get used to new norms and help them to overcome those moments when they didn't have privilege. And this will open so many opportunities for the institution itself. So my next question will be actually to you, Dr. Leslie. What can a SWOT analysis tell us about the internationalization and diversification of universities? And if anyone has anything to add on, please feel free to jump in.
Well, let's just, for some of our audience, let's just start with just the model itself, and then I think my colleagues can take it from there. So, we can look at the strengths, right? We can look at our weaknesses. We can look at opportunities, and we can look at threats. I mean, that's basically what the SWOT model asks us to do, right? So I'll I'm going to take one from each area and then, let my colleagues sort of educate me. I think we could say, oh, well, one of the strengths that we have is that we are, and I'll use your example, Dr. Georgette. We're in a diverse city. We have a pool of people that we could probably recruit from internationally to teach at our university. We have a reputation. We have a distinguished faculty and staff. We have an infrastructure. So, those kinds of strengths. So, and I'm sure there are others. And then the weakness part of it is, well, we also have entrenched privilege and power. Right. And so that would make it sort of very difficult. That might be one of the obstacles. And then the opportunity that you mentioned earlier, I think at the start of this, was that, we're living in a world that demands, right, that there's a demand for internationalization, the demand for diversity. So it's an opportunity to change, to do something to meet that demand. And then the threat. For me, the threat is always that you used better words than I did, Dr. Jet, for this. Maybe both of you did, Peter also. The threat is that of change. Change is a threat to power, a threat to profits, a threat to tenure. I mean, there's very strong forces that would prevent us from wanting to make the kind of change that we need to make. So that's what I'll start off with for the conversation.
May I add to that very quickly? I would say, one of my favorite quotes that whenever I do any work, and I always begin every presentation I do with this, which is diversity is counting the numbers, inclusion is making the numbers count. This isn't my quote, I just use it. It's a one from a Harvard professor. And I always say, if you are in a city that's, even in the US, like you're from New York, like you're from Peter, diversity's there, right? So you can attract diversity, that's great. But if it's, in the sort of, entry-level jobs, that's lovely, but we want to be able to see that diversity in the upper echelons of organizations. We want to see it represented in leadership teams. We want to make sure that, that people can see a trajectory for their careers in the organizations. And if they don't, then we're just ticking off boxes. You've got them there. But if there's, if you're hitting glass ceilings and what I call reinforced concrete, then, there's no inclusion. right? So there's that. The other thing that you touched on, Michael, and it's so interesting because I literally had this conversation with a faculty member that was posting a job at an academic institution in Canada, and he was saying, "Oh, you're going to be so proud of me, Georgette. I moved. You know how they do the job postings, and they have the, that statement that talks about inclusion. Oh, I moved it to the top." So, and I said, "Dude, like that's called ticking off the box, So I said, so let me ask you a question. So do you think the university would look at somebody from, and I listed some institutions in Canada that would not be necessarily what you would call like top tier institutions, but they're good schools, but not necessarily, And he said to me, probably they wouldn't really look at that person. And I said, why not? Well, they're not like one of the top schools in Canada. And I said, so are you actively excluding them? And he said, well, no. And I said, no, let me ask you a question. So if I was that candidate and I was absolutely brilliant, but the reason I had to go to that school was, back to your point, Michael, was that I had to take care of a parent, or my financial situation was like, I was brilliant, but my circumstances meant that I had to go to a school because closer to home, because I had to take care of sick parents or whatever. And so I chose that academic institution for personal reasons. And so that didn't mean that I was less brilliant. I just couldn't go to the top tier academic institution because I couldn't go to like UBC or Alberta or U of T to do my PhD. So did you just literally take me out of their search pool because you don't think, but you actually missed out on a brilliant candidate because you don't think and he went, you're right. And I went, right. So are you actively excluding as a result of that? Are we rethinking? Do we need to rethink the credentials? Back to your point, Michael, and I think you touched on this, Peter. Do we need to rethink how we are looking at candidates and how we are actually maybe broadening our searches when we're thinking about how we hire? Because we think this is what qualifies as excellence, but is that really what qualifies as excellence? Right? Or because if we don't do that, we're going to continue to get that homogeneous group that looks exactly the same, and we're not going to be able to diversify perspectives because there's circumstances that hold us back. I'm sure Peter has more to add to this.
Oh, that's good. I think the points are so valid and strategic. I would add also to the SWOT analysis for our listeners today, another tool to actually conduct the SWOT analysis. Futurists, we use what's called STEEP analysis. So STEEP. So scanning and understanding what's going on in those sectors of society. So S, social cultural. What are the demographic shifts? What is going in and out of culture? T, technological advances or changes or disruptions. So monitoring that always. Some organizations in the corporate world have issues management units, right? And they do this. They're strictly just scan all day long the issues in these sectors. The first E, economics. So what are the economics? Michael talked about it. In higher ed, economics is so important, right? Many institutions are tuition-driven institutions. Others, so the economics are driving decisions. The other E is the environment. So, whether you're going green, whether the environment is toxic, whether so on and so forth. And the last one, P, political, the political landscape of your country or your organization. So when we think of those 5 things, as you're doing a SWOT analysis, those could be tools to add to your toolkit. I would use T real quick out of the 5, right? So STEEPT, technology. That has been a disruption in higher ed, correct? And, something, I don't even know if some people consider it still a newer innovation, but I think that we're past that. But online education, well, those institutions that are specifically tuition driven and did not get ahead of the curve on online education are now struggling, trying to train faculty, trying to put an online platform, trying to partner with OPMs, right? Online program managers, so many things, but they're already behind the curve. And so when you think of innovations, change, these are areas that could help you in your SWOT analysis. I wanted to get very practical there. Going back to the previous question, I kept reflecting on leadership. I always go back to leadership. I don't think it's the only way to change, but I do think leaders have they are major stakeholders in institutional change. We need to talk about our board of trustees, right? Our board of trustees are so important, and usually the board of trustees reflect the legacy of the institution. And so we need to diversify our board, with other people besides men or besides those who you previously graduated. And the Board of Trustees, as they are becoming more and more diversified, can keep the president and the president's cabinet and the provost and their cabinet accountable, and vice versa. I think that the accountability piece is so important. Let's face it, even in our own personal lives as leaders, if we don't have accountability, we fall sometimes into old habits. We go back to resorting to what we know. What's higher ed going to do? It's going to fall back to being biased, to being discriminatory, to being exclusive, even though we say we're so inclusive. So those are a few pieces I wanted to throw out there.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your incredible inputs on this. But my next question will be very practical also for students. So, and staff as well, students and staff, because we do not want to, because we want to make sure that everyone who is listening right now can know what to do practically when they face any sort of inequality, discrimination, while being a member of staff or a student. And the problem here that I've faced, and many of people I know have faced in academia, in top universities, it doesn't matter, it's still there, is that those violations are so minor that it's very difficult to, like, it's so-called minor, but it's very difficult to spot them. And sometimes when you're trying to gather the evidence against certain professor that has been really racist, but it's been done like under, you know, in a such situation where you cannot really put the fact together, but the feeling is there. So the atmosphere is there. For example, there are certain situations when there is a privilege given to students of certain color, of certain race, of certain political beliefs, of certain religious beliefs. And this is a real situation. And unfortunately, it happens, even as I said, at top universities. So what do you think should be done by a student or a member of staff when they face such levels of discrimination?
I mean, I can tell you, I personally have experienced it publicly, and I've actually addressed it publicly, but it was not so much around sort of a race issue, because of course I'm what I'm going to call white passing. So although I'm actually considered a visible minority in Canada, it was much more around my gender. So as a senior executive at the university, I was presenting as a member of the senior leadership team. So I wanted you to understand, this is a group that's like 7 or 8 that ran the entire campus at the university, right? So I think at the time I was the most senior female. And I was presenting on my portfolio, and right after our CAO. So he presents, I present, public forum, live streamed. And as soon as I finished presenting, an older white gentleman in the audience asked, question, what are your qualifications for your position? Yeah, that's right, Peter. Yeah, I saw your face. So the rest of the audience in that room, like, I hear people and then murmuring, and the chair, where it's a live mic, he goes, did he just ask her for her CV? And so part of my brain goes to, like, you can imagine. And then, so I smile nicely and I say, thank you so much for your question. Although part of me is just like, so I decided to take the floor and took 3 to 5 minutes, maybe 4 or 5 minutes to talk about how I walk on water. And just decided to tell him how brilliant I was, and how in my previous roles, I did X this and turned this around and turned that around and broke records. And then I smiled really nicely again and said, does that answer your question? He went, yeah, thanks. And I said, no, thank you for asking. And then we went on to the real business. And I actually tell this story often, because when I talk about empowerment and I talk about this with women, I talk about how you own the floor and how you can use a moment of adversity as a teaching moment. And I say to them, I could have just fallen apart. I could have gotten really upset. I could have said, I'm sorry, and gotten really defensive. And I would have had every right to. But I decided to actually use it to my advantage and bring up my market value. And let me tell you, every time he saw me, he remembered me, and he was very nice. And so then we did the presentation. And then I just remember my, the vice president who was sitting there said, great job. And when I left, my phone was just blowing up with, way to go, congratulations. But the point is, if I didn't speak up for myself, I'm not sure that anybody else would have in that room, because I could tell they were all taken aback. The chair didn't say that's out of line. He just didn't know what to say. So I took control. So I think sometimes we have to also think about how do we use these, as individuals, if no one else is going to call something out, how are you going to use this as a teachable moment yourself? Because, you hope that someone's going to speak up for you, but if they don't, how are you going to own it?
That's actually brilliant. I mentioned to you that my work now has moved more into the domain of being. And so what you said, Georgette, is really spot on. So, when often we come from, and I think this perhaps addresses a portion of your question, Angelica, we come from we're not powerful. We come from we have to put up with. We come from we are vulnerable. We come from we're weak. We come from it can't change. It can't be done. I mean, that's kind of instilled in us, right? And there's a lot of truth to that. Historically, I mean, there's no question about it. But I think the opportunity is to come from when we're interacting with people that we are actually their equals, that we are actually we are knowledgeable, that we are actually I like to use the word a lot, Peter, we are actually powerful, right? When in my own experience, I found that, and I'm not as perhaps as skilled as you are, Georgette, in navigating these conversations. I'll admit that I've come from an indignation, right? You can't address me this way, and so I for example, people who have wanted to call me by my first name in meetings when everyone is being addressed as doctor, right? So my point is very much in the line with what you've said, Georgette. It's a different place to interact from when you encounter oppression or when you encounter what we would perceive as disrespect or dishonor or any of those things. And mine is to be combative. I'll add one more thing to this, Angelica, that might be useful to students because they're really the most vulnerable in our institutions, is the value of alliances. To have, when I was fighting for tenure, I brought in, and they were making noises about not giving it to me. I brought in a Latino professor from sociology. I brought in an African-American professor from, what was his field? History. We had a sit down with the administration, if you would. And so that's my approach to it. Well, if you're going to fight, I'm going to fight too. But coming from the position of, we can win, rather than, oh, gee, this is tough here and these people are terrible and I don't know what to do about it. Alliances, I think, are critical with other people who are in a similar situation.
I love this because both you, Dr. Michael, and Dr. Georgette have different approaches to fight it, but they are all working. And I believe that comes from being different personalities. Every different personality has their own way how to counter it. But the most important here is not to be shy and own your power and own this particular power you have to counter it. And as we have just a few minutes left, what would be your last advice, I think, Dr. Peter, for everyone who is watching us, who is trying to counter this?
In my own research, the folks that I interviewed that were Latinx and leading institutions at the highest level, they talked a little bit about what my colleagues are saying, that from a minoritized perspective, and I say minoritized on purpose, not minority because we have been minoritized. You usually are working twice as hard to be considered half as good. You're usually working twice as hard to be considered half as good. I think you need to be comfortable within yourself and not allow the imposter syndrome to take a hold of you. I think as minoritized groups, we need to work with each other so that, Black folks are over there, Latinx, Asian, women, LG, we need to come together. And even with white allies, and enough's enough. And that's where I think the accountability piece that I mentioned earlier is so important. But as my colleague said, as a student, as a administrator, as a faculty, I will definitely address the issue head on. I think that if you're a student, and you don't feel like you just don't, you don't dare, maybe you come from a cultural background where it's actually inappropriate to confront power, right? And that's a real thing. Then get what Michael, Dr. Michael and Dr. Zanetti are saying about get a faculty member who you affiliate with, get somebody who's in power to stand next to you and to help you out and to advocate for you. I think that would be a strategic way. So my recommendation is be confident in who you are, remain humble, but confident. And those are two dynamics that we all, deal with on a daily basis, and know that, you are a person of value, and that you were created with a calling, and that, you have purpose in life. And your creator, I don't know, I'm a person of faith. That's how I believe. My creator created me with a calling, a purpose, and I'm here on a mission. And actually my mission is to help you to get to your next level. So let's work it out. Let's leverage our differences to help one another out and strengthen each other. So thank you so much.
I love that. This is brilliant. And just before we finish this, I wanted to ask everyone in this panel to share their exciting news on their books that have been published, and so that our audience can actually read and explore and discover so much more that hasn't been discussed today within your scope of work.
Sure. All right, I'll share mine. So this is my book called Why Not You, and you'll see my hands like this on the cover, because I'm always saying to people on the other side when I'm talking to women, why not you? I'm going like looking at them going this. So this is a book that really talks about my research. It talks about all of the work that's happening, certainly, and the impact of COVID, and the research really about the scarcity of women and the lack of ability for us to move up in senior leadership jobs. And 100% of the proceeds from the book go to support women, helping empower women. So thank you for that.
Brilliant. And is it available on Amazon?
It's actually available on our website, which is www.hewwomen.com. Fantastic.
Dr. Peter?
I'll present mine real quick. I have a copy also readily handy. Untold Stories, the Latinx Leadership Experience in Higher Education. This book stems from my own experience in higher education, and really wanting to understand if other people of color and other minoritized groups were having a similar experience, or was I the only one in the desert? And, utilizing critical race theory, Latino crit theory, and just letting their narratives speak for themselves, right? So kind of like what we're talking about earlier, combating meta narratives, saying this is not who we are, this is not what we're about. And so, yeah, please, it's on Amazon, it's on all the major book, Barnes and Noble, so on and so forth. And you can also go to our website at peterreelsconsulting.com. Thank you so much.
Incredible. Thank you so much. And to you, Dr. Leslie, I know that you have an exciting book that will be extremely valuable for everyone who is trying to be authentic.
Thank you. Well, I don't know. Oh, there it is. So this is the Spanish version of my book. It's called Cómo lograr lo que realmente deseas, and it's also been published in Mandarin and in English. So the whole book is just based on my experience. I call it Lessons from My Life, and it has that element, Peter, of someone who has faith, right? That plays a role in my success, at least in life. And then some practical instructions for how to sort of tap the resources that you already have within you so you can move towards your goals. So it's on Amazon, so you can easily find it there.
Thank you so much. I was really honored to be joined by leaders in their fields, advocates for diversity and inclusion, really extraordinary, brilliant minds. Thank you so much, Dr. Georgette, Dr. Leslie, Dr. Peter. Thank you so much for your time today. And I believe that it's been extremely valuable for every listener, every viewer who has joined us today. Thank you.